Move the flower back. Oh, that's what it is. All right. Okay, so we're going to do a tea and talk about mapping the middle world.
Middle world.
And what does that mean?
So mapping the middle world being where we exist, that's where we live. Out of the three worlds, most shamanistic traditions have a three world sort of model, I guess. So there's always like land, sea, and sky, or upper world, middle world, lower world. So in the middle world, we're referring to the walking worlds where you exist every day.
Yeah. For us, mapping the middle world is an experience of, usually it's out in the forest, out in the woods, and it is a way of, is it metaphor?
Yeah, you go.
It's kind of like a metaphor for your life. So you walk out into the woods and there are different things that you'll encounter out there. And usually it's because I'm doing great. It's mirroring what's going on inside of you. So you project out into the wooded space, and we use the forest or the woods as a safe space to project onto, because otherwise we're projecting into the world of other humans, and it gets complicated, and it's not as clear, it's not as concise.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be, we're going to focus on going into the forest, going into the woods, and using that as a way of mapping the middle world. So why would you want to map the middle world?
Well, it's like asking yourself why you want to map, if anything. It's so that you know how to get around. So when you're talking about going into natural spaces to kind of release what is ailing you, it's using those natural spaces as like a direct way to commune with source or to commune with nature, right? Like forests are the lungs of the planet and whatnot. So it's a place where
Aggressive air quotes.
Well, it's a place where energy is transmuted. It's a place where carbon dioxide is turned into oxygen and things like that. It's one of those direct sources to source. So when you go into a natural space and you leave whatever energy is ailing you, it's a direct way for it to be transmuted into something positive, to become resourceful. But it's kind of like when you said going into those spaces that you're working on what's inside you and letting it out. It's kind of like making a map of your own psyche that way. So for instance, if we go into one space and I'm releasing something very, very traumatic and very, very intense, and I'm going to have a connection to that part of my mind in that space.
Yes.
Once we've done that.
Yeah.
Once I've released that energy there, I can use that as a real world map or a placeholder to be able to re-access that part of my mind or that thing that needed to be worked through in that moment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brings up a really good point about different areas of the forest. So I'll talk about this because I feel like this is like my jam.
Go for it.
Yeah. So when I enter into a forest, there's different like sections. It's almost like thinking about different rooms. And there will be certain parts, and I can feel the division now that I've done it enough. I can feel the division like when I've walked into someone else's house. And so what I do in that, I'm not a formal practitioner. I don't necessarily like leave objects necessarily or say anything out loud. Like a lot of it is in my head. So I'll just sort of connect with whatever that overarching energy is, like sort of like who rules this part of the forest. So a good example of that would be like if you're going from a part of the forest that's dominant or predominantly maple into like pines. That's a really clear division. Sometimes the divisions aren't that clear. And so you connect with whatever energy is there. And when you're not aware of these like overarching energies in these sections of the forest, you may just know, I don't feel right in this part of the forest, or I feel overjoyed in this part of the forest, or I feel like something is following me here. There's all kinds of different reactions that we have before we become conscious of these kinds of things. So you are responding to these different rooms without really necessarily knowing about it. So when you enter into these different parts, just kind of asking, how can I honor this energy? How can I honor this space? And you may begin to become aware that different parts of the forest are for different kinds of healing. So you'll be naturally attracted to cedars for one reason or another. Cedar tends to be like a really dark, womb-like space. But when I first started working with it, I conceived of it as a masculine energy.
For me, cedar is a really heart-centered space. So if I'm like really, really like achy heart-wise, a cedar forest is going to be a really good place for me to be.
And so we all, it's like developing a relationship with, you know, your friends. You have certain friends that you go to with certain kinds of issues or to confide in them for different kinds of things. And the forest is no different than that. And so that's a place that you can start to develop a relationship. One of the really important things for me was discovering that the part of the forest that I was uncomfortable to go into was the part of my mind I was uncomfortable facing. So what were the themes that were coming up for me? And if you walk through with a partner, if you have a walking buddy who is also open to this kind of weirdness, then you may notice it come up in conversation. So we naturally have a dialogue going the entire time, which some people do not appreciate in the forest. There is also time for silence, but mostly we talk the whole time. And the conversation will naturally just like turn. You'll enter a certain part and all of a sudden you're talking about something else. And then sometimes you'll leave that part and then you pick up another part of the conversation. And so it's like certain areas, certain rooms are for certain things, and you will hear it come out of your mouth, and to just go with it and to just allow it to kind of flow. And in this way, this is how it becomes like really therapeutic.
Right. Oftentimes, as well as the conversation sort of progresses, as you make your way around whatever space you're in, you'll end up coming full circle. And there does tend to be a bit of a theme, which can be wildly unintentional. It's just one of those things that happens, but there will be the whoa connection moment. And then it will not necessarily solve a problem for you, but open that door in a very big way so that you can then continue to process.
Right. So even though this is like a naturally unfolding process, we're offering this as just kind of like, I guess probably just to make people mindful of it.
Yeah.
Or
Totally.
you know, like something that I wish I had known maybe sooner, so I could have honored my walks through the woods, or like what was going on with me in a deeper way. And again, particularly the part that was most uncomfortable. So okay, let's say you're entering into this part that's most uncomfortable. Things to notice: temperature, what kind of trees are there, or what kind of vegetation is there, its relationship to light, which will also kind of correlate with temperature. What else would you say? Animals?
Yeah. I think just to kind of add a little point of the thing about the sacred walkabout or being in a forest space is that the middle world is your constant, but that is where you are most easily accessible from the other realms. So if something lower world wants to get to you, it's going to come to where you are because you can't necessarily get there as effectively, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in these spaces and you're noticing the light, the temperature, what's happening in your gut, what animals are present to you is a direct correlation to who's trying to reach you at the time, or which energies are trying to come find you, or even the way the wind is blowing, or what if it starts to rain, or if it starts to snow, or things like that. This is where you are accessible from the other realms. So the way that you are impacted in those spaces is very important to notice.
Yeah, and because it's also reflective of your psyche, it's like, you know, those different, something coming to you. I love how you put that like that's its way of accessing you from any other space. Whatever's coming to you is going to help you through whatever part of the psyche that pertains to.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
It's very as within, so without.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
So what's happening in there, whatever needs, whatever guides you have, whether or not you're incredibly close to them or not, they're going to want to be there for you. And in those situations, that's what you need to go through, and that's how they'll be helping you, is to experience that as without, so within, right?
Yeah. When I started going to the forest all the time, so I came back from yoga teacher training, which was in like kind of a jungly forest area. So we were just saturated with nature all day long, practicing yoga, eating well, all of these things. I come back here and it's like, all kinds of crazy stimulation. And so I was just drawn to going out, and I would go out by myself. But a lot of what happened was I would cry. So I would take my troubles to the trees, and it felt like when you were in, so I guess what I'm tapping into now is the isolation portion of it.
Mm.
So we're kind of like touched on partnering up, but what it is to go alone. And there was one time in the winter when I came to what I consider my healing. It was my healing forest of that time. So my healing forest, we'll get into that later. But it was my healing forest of the time, and I had tears to cry. Like I had so many tears to cry. I was just in a place and I needed my healing forest, and there was like a truck that was stuck, and like someone else was like helping to push the truck, and I was just like, I can't even look at it. I pretended it wasn't there because I had so many tears to cry, and I was like, I'll feel guilty about this later that I didn't go and help those people. I don't think I could have made a difference, to be honest, but it was just such a clear example of how like I had a direct mission for why I was there. I needed to walk a loop and cry out my tears and touch a certain tree and connect. I also have found in the solitary journeys through the particularly in the winter, it's very interesting because there's this like extra survival element to it where you're like, I am going to freeze to death. I don't know where I am. So map making can be on a practical level very helpful when you're wandering about on your own. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if I'm jumping into something. I'll tangent. It's fine. Okay, so the other aspect of the winter that I want to get into is about. So I tend to take the role of navigator. What would you say how would you describe it?
So when I think of you, you definitely navigate, you create paths, and then I either lead or support from behind.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but path creation is actually kind of limited in the summer. So a lot of times we think of like here in Canada, especially like we're like, we go out into the forest in the summer because camping and da 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 da. That is actually the most limited time to explore a forest or to map make, because there's so much overgrowth that you're limited to the paths that humans normally take. Most of the deer paths are almost inaccessible to you. And bugs. Like we once went to Longwoods, which is just like west of the city here, and there were so many bugs and it was so awful that we were chased out. And those are messages too. Like if the forest doesn't want you there, it will let you know if you're paying attention. So there will be signs. If it's a miserable trudge, pay attention to that. It will also like mess with your sense of time. That can happen as well, where it will make you aggressively present, or you just sort of float about and don't even notice that time has gone by. Mm-hmm. All of those things are like lessons. All of those things are valuable in the long run.
Right.
Okay, so back to paths, unless you wanted to say something.
No.
Okay. So when we're coming, now is the perfect time. This is when paths open. Okay, this is when you could be walking the same path in the forest over and over and over again, and you look to your right, and there's a new path that has opened for you. If a new path opens for you, I would encourage you to follow it. No one's no one sue me if you get lost. It's not my fault. Trust your intuition though. If you have a good sense of where you are spatially, I know there's some people that don't, but if you have a good sense of where you are spatially, trust yourself. You always get to a path. And sometimes it's really surprising where you end up. And that's kind of where you start to reroute. And this happens in your psyche as well. You start to reroute the traditional pathways, the worn down trenches, and you start to make connections that you never would have made before. So when you follow the deer trail, you realize, oh, that one part of the path is actually a lot closer to that other part of the path than I knew. There was some sort of winding situation that happened, or like there was a river between, or there was something. And you discover things that you didn't know about a familiar path. So as you're walking in the autumn, the winter is wide open. Like you can walk anywhere. I don't know why anyone walks on a path in the winter, to be honest. Usually they're very dangerous. Here in Canada, they're like covered in ice. The well-worn paths are treacherous and dangerous.
It's a very dramatic situation.
It's a very dramatic situation, but everything is dramatic in the winter. So like your sense of like, okay, if I do get myself lost on this deer path, I'm out here alone. My cell phone has died because it's too cold. I'm gonna die out here. And it becomes this really intense like survival situation. But yeah, so this is an amazing time to explore. Snowless time is definitely less high stakes if you're out there alone, to discover these deer paths, to discover these other ways of moving about in that space. And what you'll find is you come to these openings or these like beautiful, beautiful spaces that you wouldn't otherwise be able to access. And it's in those spaces that you can experience different forms of intensity. Do you want to talk about those intensities?
Sometimes it gets so intense that you just need to reach over and grab your friend's face.
That has never happened.
That happened one time. It was wild. She's like, am I still here? And grabbed me by the face. It was so swell. But there have been times where we've wandered entirely off path and had like moments of like intense bliss or ecstasy, or like it seems so unreal and so perfect and beautiful. And in those moments when you're allowing yourself to really feel your genuine feelings and bounce it off of a space that seems untouched, it allows you to find those places in your psyche that are untouched and still beautiful, or untouched and incredibly tragic, or the path to get to that space. The amount of times that I have been cut up by thorns but found my way into some gorgeous space and just had to let it in and let it ring through my heart, it's worthwhile. But it all comes down to that connectivity. And like you were saying earlier, sometimes you might find that one part of the path is closer or to another part of the path. You don't need to go through this big section that you hate. And working through the weird brambles to get there is creating a new pathway for you, so that you've walked that path. You've done the thing that you hate. You don't have to do it anymore. It's a new way that's open for you to be able to process those things on the outside of the forest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's really fun to hide from people.
Oh my God.
When you know the paths that are not the main paths, you can avoid people like an animal does. And actually, that's an experience we've had before where we felt like wild animals. Mm-hmm. And we're like sometimes we'll be in a space that's like, it's almost semi-visible to people on the path and freeze, kind of like a deer would
see us.
They don't see us. We're like in an open wooded area off the path, and they do not see that we're there, even though we're standing there. But you just kind of.
There are also, sometimes I wonder, like, if maybe some years from now I will hear some sort of urban legend about these two horrible women who keep spilling out of the brambles in front of families in the forest, because if you hear that story, it's us.
With like branches stuck in our
like
hand.
burrs and dirt, and sometimes you run into people you know and you're like, hey. They're like, okay. But they're not living their best life. Nope.
But I think there's also some value to the path itself. So if we think of the path as representative of your path in life, like your journey through life or your spiritual path or what have you, you know, what does it mean? Like, how does it feel to have this path in front of you? So something that my daughter said to me was that she wants to take the path because she wants to respect the path makers. They made the path. And so she wants to respect the path that they have laid out before her. She does not support going off path, which is really, really tricky for me because I don't support being on path. I like to go my own way, but what is the value of that? And sometimes you can get in some dense forest, you can get in some dense bramble or the thick of it. And oh, there was that insight. I'm coming to it. Okay. So you're in this like dense area. I feel like it was on our 7-hour trek around Wildwood. You're like in this area that's like, there's no deer path because the deer path will eventually end. And then all of a sudden there's no paths through. So you just have to get through the thick of it. But the weirdest thing is that you go through this like thick part. So you followed a path. You found a deer path off of that. So the deer path is kind of comfortable, somewhat comfortable. It's a little bit worn down, particularly in the autumn. And then it comes to a space where there's like, it's like the deer disappeared and it's just thick. And then
there you are.
Choose a direction. Like you're going to be climbing through stuff. So just choose a direction. That's all you can do. And then somehow you will end up spilling out onto a path. So then when you come to that path, what is that feeling? It's comfort. Like, it's like, oh, like relief. It's relief. I can take a breath. And so that's kind of interesting, isn't it? That it's like, you know, I was lost and now I'm found. I feel like that's a Christian song that we sang at camp. Take it away, Ilyra.
To kind of relate to what did you say about living your everyday life? Anyway, my point,
the path being
right.
Yeah.
My point being, for me, for the work that I do outside of this, I find that map making and
which is what?
Being a doula.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm a birth worker. But I find that map making, especially when it comes to my spirituality, has allowed me to understand my role in my birth work, in that I am an in-between person. I hold a liminal space in supporting birthing people to bring life into the world. That is very much holding a liminal space. And so I find that when I'm out in the world, out in the wild, and kind of moving between those sort of spaces, it has allowed me to understand the intensity of the responsibility of that. So very much, again, the whole as without, so within. And working with somebody who creates paths, it allows me to be able to kind of flit around, and I can get into spaces that Liz can't get, and Liz can create spaces that I can't get to. But it has taught me so much about the responsibility of being within those spaces and what it means to ferry people through places. And so creating those maps for myself has allowed me the ability to go back to those feelings and go back to those experiences or what I released into those spaces. And it enhances my empathy for people when they're in their own vulnerable space. And I think that that's really, really important as well.
Yeah, because you can, like, you end up being in the environment of that feeling. Like the space that you're in out in nature will reflect that feeling, and so you know what it's like to stand in the center of it. And so that's like really beautiful for enhancing empathy. I'm wondering if you could share with us about. Do you like how I did that? Okay. I'm wondering if you could share with us about breadcrumbs.
Breadcrumbs. Yeah. So another thing for me, not being a natural path maker and needing to be able to get back and forth between spaces, is that a way that I map for myself is to leave myself breadcrumbs. It's very Hansel and Gretel. And that's not to say that I don't have a good sense of direction, but when you're doing the kind of work that you do, releasing emotional things out in the forest, when you're an emotional basket case of a Pisces like I am, sometimes it's overwhelming. Sometimes you forget where you've been and you relive things over and over again. It's super swell. But one way that I have created stability in that is to, when I have a big experience in a space, often I will find a token. So it'll be a feather or a rock or something. Something will find its way into my hands. And oftentimes I will continue my journey through wherever we're going, and I might leave it somewhere else and then pick up something new from that space and leave it somewhere else. And for me, leaving this breadcrumb trail is a way for me to be able to acknowledge my physical presence within that space. But I can also, when I'm meditating, call back on those items and find them in a middle world journey, for instance. Or sometimes I will bring, if I'm having an especially big moment in a space, I will bring that token home with me. And then I have it almost like a toolkit to be able to meditate with and get back to where I was, get back to that mind frame, or get back to that space that I was in, so that it is greater expanding the map that I have, and also allowing me to connect my middle world experience with an upper or lower world journey.
Yeah. I think that also touches on the idea of bringing things in or out of the forest. So I think we should probably touch on that as well.
That's important.
I'll talk about altars if you want to talk about like
stewarding the land.
Yep. Okay. So certain parts and certain forests will perhaps, or certain things in a forest may call to you as a place to leave offerings. So there are several forests, I'll use my own experience. There are several forests where I have natural sort of altars, like places where I leave things. And there's certain energies or entities, if you will, you could call them deities, whatever it is for you. Like, you don't have to believe in what I believe in to get anything out of this. But a place where, all right, so for instance, you're working with a masculine energy. That's masculine energies tend to be very eye for an eye, or like it's like you give me this thing, like you give me this like metal offering and I will reciprocate. Like it's like a very one-to-one kind of exchange, transactional, that's the word I'm looking for. So if you have like an outdoor altar to a masculine energy, if it just feels right, if it just feels called to, you may develop a relationship where each time you go to that space, you leave an offering. What that can also do is create a really large energetic resonance with that space or connection with that space. An example, so I had a student who didn't know that I had an altar at a specific forest, but she went there and she was like, if Elizabeth hasn't been here, she should go here. Like she felt me immediately when she got out of the car, actually. And I have a deep relationship with that area, and I have like an ongoing altar situation. Some altars are for just a period of time or just for a certain amount of work that you're doing. So there's like another one that, you know, I have reverence for it, but I did my work with it and made my offerings to it. And now we no longer like have business together, I guess you could say. Is that the way?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So this is a great way of connecting into a forest, personalizing a forest, and also like giving back and making offerings. And it doesn't have to be like, go with your intuition. I do not believe in being prescriptive, and I don't believe in telling you what your rituals should be. So whatever that feels like for you, whatever you feel is right. So maybe it's things from home, or maybe it's what I think what you're going to talk about is stewarding.
Yeah. So I guess like I do a lot of leaving offerings. For me, most of the time it's food. So I'll share a lot of food with my altar at home, and then I'll leave those remnants out at my other altars and spaces. I think my point with stewarding the land, I think it's interesting because it divides this divides the middle world into the idea of the spiritual overlap versus the tangible middle world. So coming from a culture of land stewardship and being Indigenous, it is also important. Your responsibility in that space is to not screw with it. So when you're leaving offerings and when you're taking things out, it needs to be done respectfully. So for instance, bones, people love bones. People love to find bones. It's a beautiful thing to come across something decaying. But not every time are you welcome to take those bones. And then bringing things into the forest as well. For me, it's always natural things. It's always things that will decompose. I'm not bringing in plastics and I'm not burning candles. I'm not leaving paraffin wax in these natural spaces, because part of your responsibility in mapping a space and connecting with it is that you have to care for it the way that it cares for you. And that reverence is very important. So in the idea of stewardship within your spiritual practice, you're not disturbing the natural processes of those spaces, because that is selfish and it's not reverent. So bringing in things that will like choke out small animals or foods or things like that to be artificial and impure, and probably if they're bad for you, they're especially bad for the things that might eat them in the woods, And if you find something, if you find a beautiful thing like a skull or something, and there's already a toad living in it, that skull's not for you. And you need to respect those items. If you're breadcrumbing, you can't just be ripping things off of bushes and putting them in other places. The things that find you are meant to be treated respectfully, because that only further enhances your connection with that space. And it is incredibly disrespectful to do it otherwise, I think, personally. So it's just something to keep in mind. Your connectivity is a two-way street. It's not something for you to just come in, crash around, take stuff, wreck things, and go. Because it does you a disservice, and it does the entities a disservice, and it does the natural spaces a disservice if you do it otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that's probably when I was saying about being prescriptive or telling you what rituals should be. If you're like reading a ritual in a book, or someone has told you a ritual and they say you need this much cedar or you need this thing or whatever, and you just sort of like go and harvest it from a forest that you don't have a relationship with, without it being something that you were guided to do naturally from your own guides or your own practice, it has that level of falsity to it. It has that destructive quality to it. It's not for us to just like rip things because a book says to do it. That is where ritual becomes prescriptive,
where become
inauthentic, or unaligned, and what we're suggesting is that you allow the forest to tell you. And so you may end up with an object in your hand that you don't actually take out of the forest, like you move a pine cone from one pine forest to another, or something of that nature, and it never leaves the woods with you, but it traveled with you for a period of time. Mm-hmm. So listening to that as opposed to listening to the world of humans. There's a lot out there that will tell you what to do, and we will not tell you what to do necessarily. We will tell you what's respectful or like teach you or guide you, but generally as a rule, you should be listening to yourself and your guides when you're entering into those spaces, and not just your guides, but like the environment around you. Mm-hmm. And you will begin to feel the different resonance from the objects that come back with you as well. Like if something is meant to be with you, it will feel right in your space. If it wasn't, it wasn't. Sometimes things are gifts. Sometimes, you're harvesting something and you don't know why, and then the meaning of it unfolds later. So it's about being open, really, to that kind of thing.
I think that's kind of like, it's one of those things, the more you do it, the more you'll know. And again, to sort of reflect on what you might work through mentally, emotionally in those spaces. The more you do it, the more you'll know. And it just sort of, it's the two sides of a coin of completing yourself, becoming more whole, is knowing that deep knowing that you get as you become more aligned.
Yeah. And I think finally, like the last thing that I want to touch on is the idea of the walk being sacred or being devotional. So again, let's touch on the ritual aspect of things. So a lot of spirituality or a lot of witchcraft and things like that will be very like, do this at this time in this way, you know, acknowledge the moon in this way, acknowledge this in this way, whatever. But there's a way in which our existence is devotion. There's a way in which the way that we move about in space and time is sacred and is devotional. And certainly from a Celtic perspective, the walk is sacred. I can't speak for other cultures, but I do know that there are other cultures that where walking is very is considered devotional. So if you consider that you are not just going for a walk in the woods, you are going to demonstrate your devotion to yourself, to your spirit, to your psyche. It is a sacred act to move through that space and to allow the messages of that space to come through and to allow yourself to face things you may not want to face. And as we were talking, I kept going back to, we were in like an overgrown orchard yesterday. And I keep going back to that place because there is something about what I was learning in that space. There was something about what I was saying in that space that's unfinished. And so I feel a calling to go back there and to revisit those sorts of things. And sometimes you'll find that you may find that things get wrapped up and sometimes you're not quite finished yet, and those spaces will call you back. And that's the sacred relationship, you know. That was not something I had when I was, you know, walking along a path and enjoying the beautiful leaves. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but this is where it becomes a devotional act. Like everything we've just been talking about for however long we've been talking about it is the way that you can, map making in the middle world, walking through a forest is a devotional act.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think just kind of to add to that, to bolster that thought, like for me specifically, the act of devotion in that, like, it depends on what's being worked through or where we are and whatnot, but a lot of time that time is devotion to myself as well. And for me, a lot of my work and what I'm supposed to be working through is a lot of ancestral healing. And so devoting that time to healing myself is healing my bloodline and being able to put a stop to the things that no longer serve my family and that bloodline. So again, connecting to those spaces it's something for me, and working through the things that I work through puts a stop to the things that are no longer going to serve what needs to move forward. So devotion to deities and devotion to entities and devotion to spaces, but also devotion to you. And that's really important.
I think the ancestor thing is really interesting. I was reflecting on this a little bit earlier because when I went to training in the UK, or anytime I've been to the UK, that is where I'm like mostly made up of like England, Ireland, Scotland, like that's the lineage that I come from. And when I'm in the UK, I connect in, like my guides are present, I connect with the energies. It's a lot easier for me. And so noticing that relationship, like maybe certain terrains, like depending on how, you know, how many bones of your ancestors are buried in that land, the resonance may be different for you, which doesn't mean that you can't honor it and connect with it. Because I very much love the woods around me, and I've created like a circle of trust. Trustfall. I've trust fallen into local forests, but
so many thorns.
But maybe the resonance isn't as strong because you don't have Or maybe like even, you know, there's a certain county here in Ontario where there are a lot of bones of my ancestors there. And so the connection is different. And you may, that's another way that it's devotional and sacred, is that that connection to the ancestor is literally like, if your ancestors' bones are under the ground, there's a resonance that comes up and that you are connecting with. And it's going to be easier if the bones of your ancestors are there.
Literally, your DNA is in the earth.
Yeah, exactly. You are
part of what is fertilizing the ground at that point, which is beautiful.
Yeah, and yeah, so I wanted to just mention that while certain places may not be as easy, or you may feel like I don't belong here, you can always honor something that isn't connected to you on a DNA level. You can always honor that, and it may not be as easy, but it's a worthwhile process. Yeah. So that's what we have for you about map making in the middle worlds, and what? Is that it?
Awkward.
Finger guns. I have to find. Oh, okay, cool. Recording.